The reels turned at 4 feet per second in a chamber the size of a warehouse basement. Not in Berlin. In London, in a processing facility the CIA set up because you can't transcribe 443,000 conversations on site. 50 translators working in shifts. The tape arrived in diplomatic pouches 3 times a week through 1955 and into early 1956, and nobody told them they were processing compromised material. George Blake knew about the tunnel before the first shovel broke ground. He sat in planning meetings in 1953. SIS officer, decorated, trusted, already working for the KGB since Korea. When CIA briefed British intelligence on Operation Gold because the tap point sat in the British sector and they needed cover, Blake took notes. Then he met his handler and handed over everything. The Soviets knew the route, the depth, the target cables, the construction timeline. They knew before the tunnel existed. But the tape kept coming. 400 feet per day is conservative. Some days hit 600 when multiple trunk lines lit up simultaneously. The CIA thought they had the intelligence coup of the decade. Conversations between Soviet military command in Karlshorst and Moscow, troop movements, supply routes, officer gossip, technical specifications read aloud over supposedly secure landlines. I've seen estimates that place the total haul at 368,000 fully transcribed conversations. Others say 443,000 total intercepts with partial transcription. The numbers blur because the sheer volume became unmanageable. They built card catalogs, cross-referenced names, flagged keywords, generated 1,750 intelligence reports that went to analysts who built assessments that went to policymakers who made decisions based on information the KGB had decided to let them hear. The tunnel ran for 11 months and 11 days. Here's what nobody at CIA understood in real time. Moscow faced a choice the moment Blake reported the operation. Shut it down immediately and save face, but expose their source, or let it run and control the narrative. They chose door 2. Which meant every conversation that went through those cables after April 1954 happened with Soviet awareness that Americans were listening. Not every conversation. The volume was too high, the cable capacity too broad. You can't script 443,000 calls. But the sensitive material, deployment orders, technical capabilities, strategic assessments, those could be managed, fed carefully, salted with truth, and wrapped in static. The translators in London didn't know any of this. They just processed tape, marked timestamps, typed transcripts, sent them up the chain where analysts tried to build a picture of Soviet operations in East Germany from fragments of phone calls between officers who maybe knew, maybe didn't know, that their words would end up in a filing cabinet in Washington. Blake got exposed in 1961. Different operation, different betrayal. When CIA traced back his access, the tunnel revelation hit like a secondary blast. Every report generated from those intercepts had to be reevaluated. Was it genuine? Was it feed? How much of what they thought they learned about Soviet doctrine and deployment actually represented a carefully managed deception operation? I don't think anyone's ever published a comprehensive answer to that question. You dig toward the enemy because the alternative is staying ignorant, and that's worse. The engineering problem. 1,476 feet of tunnel through Berlin clay that conducts vibration like a drumhead. The target sat underneath Schonefelder Chaussee in the Soviet sector, 3 trunk cables carrying military and diplomatic traffic between Karlshorst and Moscow. To reach them, you start in Rudow in the American sector, dig east, cross the border underground, and hope nobody notices. Clay telegraphs sound. Drop a wrench at the working face, and you might as well ring a doorbell at the Soviet compound half a mile away. So, they didn't drop wrenches. They built the tunnel with sandbag-lined walls and rubber padding on every surface. Excavation happened by hand toward the end. No jackhammers, no machinery louder than a ventilation fan. 6 months of digging in shifts, 24 hours a day, moving dirt in buckets. The warehouse cover sat above the vertical shaft, a fake radar installation that explained the construction and the security perimeter. Trucks came and went, removing spoil hidden under equipment tarps. The Soviets almost certainly photographed every vehicle, counted every trip, built a file. Blake had already told them what to look for. Here's the tangent. The target cables were ALT-6 specification, which is Soviet military standard for underground trunk lines. Armored, pressurized, buried at specific depth per doctrine. The CIA had to know the exact specifications to build the tap rig, which meant they'd acquired Soviet engineering manuals somehow. I couldn't find documentation of how they got those manuals, though I looked. Probably espionage, possibly defector material. It's the kind of detail that stays classified because it reveals collection methods still in use. The tap itself sat in a separate chamber at the end of the tunnel. Not a splice. You can detect splices through impedance changes. They built an induction coil rig that wrapped around the cable without breaking insulation. The Soviets kept pressurizing the line to detect breaches, and the pressure never dropped because there was no breach. Just a coil pulling signal through electromagnetic induction, feeding it back down the tunnel to the recorder array. 11 amplifiers, 50 recording heads. The system ran hot, literal heat. The electronics put off enough warmth that they needed dedicated cooling or the whole thing would cook itself. So they installed air conditioning in a tunnel 20 feet underground in Cold War Berlin and hoped the condensation wouldn't short anything critical. It worked for almost a year. The volume of cable traffic surprised everyone, including the CIA techs who built capacity for what they thought was generous overhead. They maxed out the recorder capacity in the first month and had to add machines. The reels stacked up faster than couriers could remove them. At peak operation, the tunnel was generating intelligence product faster than London could process it, which meant backlog, which meant some conversations sat on shelves for months before anyone transcribed them, by which point the information was often stale. Troop movements already completed, officers already transferred, the tactical window closed while the tape waited in a queue. But they kept recording anyway because stopping meant going deaf, and that wasn't acceptable. The East German crew that discovered the tunnel on April 22, 1956, had instructions to act surprised. You can see it in the photographs the Soviets released. Workers standing around the exposed tap chamber, looking confused, Soviet officers examining equipment with expressions staged for cameras. The whole performance was theater. Moscow had known for 22 months. Now they needed to shut it down without explaining how they knew, which meant orchestrating a plausible accident. The cover story, routine maintenance on the Schonefelder Chaussee trunk line. Crew digs down to inspect cable, finds tunnel, raises alarm. Soviet command expresses shock and outrage at American espionage. Western press gets invited to tour the facility. Everyone pretends this is breaking news. The tightrope walk was protecting Blake. If the Soviets reacted too fast or too precisely, if they showed detailed knowledge of tunnel specifications or construction timeline, someone at CIA might start asking how Moscow knew what to look for. So the discovery had to look accidental, random, the kind of thing that happens when you're fixing underground infrastructure and stumble onto something unexpected. I don't know if the East German workers were briefed or genuinely surprised. The photographs don't tell you that. But the Soviet officers definitely knew their inspection of the tap chamber looks too methodical, too focused on specific components. They're examining the equipment like men who've already read the technical specifications, which of course they had, courtesy of Blake's reports. The propaganda value was immediate. Soviet media ran stories about American perfidy and violation of East German sovereignty. They trucked journalists through the tunnel in groups, let them photograph the recorder array, the ventilation system, the tap rig still attached to the cables. Every image reinforced the narrative. American intelligence caught red-handed running illegal operations on socialist territory. What they didn't publish, how long they'd known, the calculation Moscow made to let it run, the intelligence value of controlling what CIA thought it was learning versus the propaganda value of exposing it. Western press treated it as an embarrassment. CIA got roasted in editorial pages for getting caught. Alan Dulles gave no public comment, which was probably smart because what could he say that wouldn't make it worse? The tunnel had been compromised from conception but produced genuine intelligence anyway. Try explaining that without admitting you don't know which parts were real and which parts were feed. Blake attended meetings where the exposure was discussed, probably sat in rooms where SIS and CIA officers tried to figure out how the Soviets discovered the tunnel. His handler must have briefed him carefully. Act concerned, offer theories, don't deflect too hard or too soft. He played the role for 5 more years before a different operation burned him. The tunnel itself stayed intact initially. The Soviets didn't fill it in or demolish it. They turned it into a museum. Guided tours for East German youth groups and visiting delegations. Look at American espionage. Look at the equipment they used. Look at how we caught them. Some of that equipment was still there in 1989 when the wall came down, sitting in the chamber like artifacts from a previous geological era. I've seen photos from reunification-era inspections. The recorder array corroded, the tap rig still clamped to cables that hadn't carried signal in 30 years. The performance worked. Nobody suspected Blake for another 5 years. The number is 368,000 conversations fully transcribed. Some sources say 443,000 total intercepts, but that includes partial transcripts and recordings too degraded to process. Either way, the volume is absurd. 50 translators working in London couldn't keep up. The backlog grew faster than they could clear it. A conversation recorded in June 1955 might not get transcribed until October, by which point the tactical intelligence was worthless. Officer movements already completed, supply shipments already delivered, unit rotations already executed. But quantity became its own asset despite the compromise. Here's why. Even if the KGB wanted to sanitize every sensitive conversation, they couldn't manage it at scale. 400 feet of tape per day means hundreds of simultaneous calls across multiple trunk lines. You can control strategic-level discussions, brief the generals, script the important calls, make sure deployment orders sound right when Americans hear them later. But you can't micromanage a captain calling his logistics officer about truck maintenance or a signals lieutenant complaining about radio equipment shortages. The small stuff leaked through. Personnel complaints, equipment failures, administrative chaos. The mundane operational texture of running a military occupation force in East Germany. That texture had intelligence value because it revealed morale problems, supply chain weaknesses, technical limitations the Soviets couldn't fully mask without shutting down military communications entirely, which they couldn't do. The occupation required functional command infrastructure. Orders had to flow. Coordination had to happen. Moscow couldn't sacrifice operational effectiveness just to deny CIA access to gossip and logistics chatter. So, the transcripts piled up. Cross-referenced card catalogs with thousands of Soviet officer names. Traffic analysis showing communication patterns between units. Technical vocabulary that revealed equipment types and capabilities. Personality assessments built from how officers spoke to subordinates. Which ones were competent, which ones were political appointees skating by on party credentials. The CIA generated 1,750 intelligence reports from the tunnel material. I don't know how many of those reports contained information the KGB actively wanted CIA to have versus information that slipped through because the volume was unmanageable. Probably a mix. Some reports were certainly feed, strategic assessments designed to mislead about Soviet capabilities or intentions. Others were probably genuine because they derived from low-level conversations nobody bothered to sanitize. The analysts in Washington didn't know which was which. They evaluated reports based on internal consistency and corroboration from other sources. But if the KGB was sophisticated enough, they could feed consistent lies across multiple channels. Or they could mix truth and deception in ratios designed to build credibility for the lies that mattered. This is the paranoia trap of compromised intelligence. Once you know the source was burned, every piece of information becomes suspect. But discarding everything means losing potentially genuine material. So you keep using it carefully, hedging assessments, looking for independent confirmation, never quite trusting but unable to ignore. The tunnel material stayed relevant for years. Reports generated in 1955 fed into assessments written in 1958, 1960, 1962. The intelligence didn't expire just because the collection method got exposed. Analysts kept mining the transcripts for patterns and details, always wondering how much Moscow had shaped what they were reading. Nobody ever published a comprehensive damage assessment. Maybe it's still classified. Maybe nobody wanted to admit they couldn't determine which parts were real. I imagine the transcripts are still archived somewhere. Boxes of yellowing paper in a warehouse, cross-referenced to recordings nobody's listened to in 60 years. George Blake walked into the first planning meeting for Operation Gold in late 1953 and took notes like everyone else. SIS officer. Decorated for service in Korea, where he'd been captured and held prisoner for 3 years. Trusted. The kind of career trajectory that gets you read into sensitive joint operations with CIA. When the Americans briefed British intelligence on the tunnel plan, because the tap point sat in the British sector and they needed diplomatic cover, Blake was in the room. Then he met his KGB handler and reported everything. The timeline matters. Blake was recruited in 1951 while still a prisoner in North Korea. Ideological conversion, they said later, though I'm skeptical of neat narratives about why people betray. Whatever his reasons, he'd been reporting to Moscow for 2 years before the tunnel even got proposed. His access was comprehensive. Operational plans, engineering specs, construction timeline, target cables, the whole architecture. The KGB couldn't have asked for better placement. A source inside the planning phase meant they knew everything before dirt got moved. They could prepare, script responses, decide what intelligence to sacrifice and what to protect. Blake's courier system fascinates me, though I couldn't find detailed documentation of how it worked. The standard dead drop protocols, chalk marks, package exchanges, coded signals, those are known. But the specific mechanics of how he got tunnel documentation to his handlers while maintaining cover in London, that's murky. Probably photographed documents at home. Probably had a camera hidden in ordinary objects. The tradecraft manuals from that era describe hollow coins and modified lighters, but not which specific items Blake used. Dead-end detail? That. Interesting, but connects to nothing relevant to the tunnel's operational history. What matters? His reporting gave Moscow decision space. They knew about Operation Gold before construction started, which meant they could shape the intelligence environment before CIA heard the first conversation. That's strategic advantage, not just knowing what the enemy collected, but controlling what they thought they learned. Blake attended damage assessment meetings after the tunnel got exposed, sat in rooms where SIS officers tried to figure out how the Soviets discovered it. He probably offered theories, expressed appropriate concern, played his role carefully because getting caught meant execution or life imprisonment, and he knew it. He stayed clean until 1961. Different operation, a Polish defector named Michael Goleniewski brought information that eventually pointed to a mole in SIS. The investigation took months. Blake kept working, kept reporting, probably knew the walls were closing, but couldn't run without confirming guilt. They arrested him in April. Trial happened in camera. He got 42 years, which was symbolic. 1 year for each agent he'd compromised, according to the prosecutor. He escaped in 1966. Ladder over the wall at Wormwood Scrubs, car waiting, route to East Germany and then Moscow. Lived there until 2020. Died at 98, never expressed regret, gave interviews where he defended his choices as ideologically necessary. I don't care about his justifications. What bothers me is the operational damage. One man with the right access compromised the most ambitious SIGINT operation of the early Cold War before it began. All the engineering brilliance, all the risk taken by the tunnel crew, all the processing capacity in London, nullified by a source in the planning meetings. That's the fragility of human intelligence. Technology you can secure, codes you can encrypt. But people are the vulnerability you can't eliminate. Moscow made the calculation in weeks, maybe days, shut down the tunnel immediately and save operational security, but expose Blake, or let it run and control the intelligence product. They chose the second option, and that choice reveals something about Soviet priorities in 1954. Blake was worth more than denial. A source inside SIS with access to joint Anglo-American operations, still early in his career, with decades of potential reporting ahead, you don't burn that asset to prevent one SIGINT collection program, especially when you can manage what the collection program hears. So, the KGB let the tunnel run for 11 months and 11 days while shaping the information flow. Not every conversation, the volume made total control impossible. But the conversations that mattered, the ones containing actual strategic intelligence, those could be sanitized or scripted or simply avoided. Don't discuss sensitive deployments on tapped lines. Route important traffic through different channels. Brief officers on what they could say and what stayed off the cables. The genius was using the tunnel as a deception channel. CIA thought they had a secret ear on Soviet military communications. The Soviets knew CIA was listening, which meant anything said on those cables would be taken as genuine intercept material, assigned high credibility because the Americans thought the collection was covert. Feed them what you want them to believe, and let them think they stole it. I don't know the specifics of what misinformation went through those cables. That's the kind of thing that stays classified forever because it reveals deception methodologies still in use. But the strategic logic is obvious. If you can control what your adversary learns while they think they're conducting espionage, you can shape their threat assessments and operational planning. The 11-month runtime suggests Moscow was milking maximum value from the deception opportunity. Maybe they had specific intelligence objectives to accomplish. Maybe they were waiting for Blake to report something even more valuable before burning the tunnel. Maybe they just wanted to see how long they could run the operation before exposure became necessary. April 1956 is when they decided the tunnel had served its purpose. The propaganda value of exposing American espionage outweighed the intelligence value of continuing the deception. Or maybe Blake's position had changed and he no longer had access worth protecting at the cost of keeping the tunnel secret. The timing might have been strategic, might have been coincidental, might have been forced by something completely unrelated to tunnel operations. Nobody's published a detailed explanation of why Moscow chose that specific month to orchestrate the discovery. What's documented? They managed the shutdown carefully. The staged discovery protected Blake while delivering propaganda victory. Soviet press got months of material about American violations of East German sovereignty. The tunnel became a museum exhibit proving Western perfidy. And Blake stayed operational for 5 more years, collecting intelligence that probably mattered more than anything the tunnel ever produced. That's the asymmetry of the operation. CIA invested enormous resources building the tunnel, running the tap, processing hundreds of thousands of conversations. The Soviets invested one source in the planning meetings and gained control of the entire collection product plus strategic deception opportunities plus eventual propaganda victory. The efficiency is almost irritating. All that American engineering brilliance and operational daring, negated by one well-placed mole who took notes in meetings and passed them to his handler. But the conversations still got recorded, the transcripts still got filed, and some of the intelligence still had value despite the compromise. Some of the intercepts mattered anyway, and that's the part that complicates the damage assessment. The Soviets couldn't sanitize everything. The sheer volume defeated total control. Even if Moscow wanted to script every conversation, they couldn't coordinate hundreds of officers across dozens of units to stay on message 24 hours a day. People forget briefings. They get lazy. They assume secure lines are actually secure and say things they shouldn't. Tactical noise leaked through constantly. Unit movements that weren't strategic enough to warrant special handling. Equipment complaints revealing what hardware was actually deployed versus what was listed in official inventories. Personnel conflicts showing which commanders were competent and which were political appointees coasting on party credentials. That texture had intelligence value. Not the kind that wins wars, but the kind that builds understanding of how Soviet forces actually operated versus how doctrine said they should operate. The gap between theory and practice, visible in casual conversations between officers who didn't think Americans were listening or didn't care because the topic seemed insignificant. technical details the KGB couldn't fully mask without crippling operations. A signals officer troubleshooting radio interference describes equipment specifications because he needs help fixing the problem. A logistics officer coordinating supply delivery mentions truck models and fuel consumption rates because that's how you coordinate logistics. The information gets recorded even though it reveals capabilities Moscow would prefer to keep classified. Personality assessments proved durable. How officers spoke to subordinates, who was respected versus who was feared, which commanders had real authority versus nominal rank. That came through in conversational tone and relationship dynamics no amount of scripting could fully control. The CIA built profiles of Soviet leadership in East Germany from those conversations, and some of those assessments stayed relevant for years. Troop movements were harder to fake than you'd think. You can script one conversation about a deployment, but coordinating movement requires dozens of calls across multiple units over several days. Falsifying that pattern convincingly while maintaining actual operational capability would require resources the Soviets probably didn't want to spend. Easier to just move units quietly and accept that some information would leak through the tap. The intercepts that probably mattered most, inadvertent revelations about Soviet technical limitations, equipment that failed more often than expected, communications security protocols that weren't followed consistently, maintenance problems suggesting Soviet hardware wasn't as reliable as Western intelligence assumed. That kind of information is hard to fabricate convincingly because it requires admitting weakness, and the KGB's deception strategy probably focused on exaggerating strength rather than manufacturing false vulnerabilities. I don't know what percentage of the 1,750 intelligence reports contained genuinely useful material versus feed. Nobody's published that analysis, and probably nobody could perform it definitively, even with full access to archives. You'd need to know Soviet intentions in 1955, compare them to what CIA heard through the tunnel, then evaluate which assessments matched reality and which were deception. Some reports were certainly garbage, strategic assessments the KGB wanted CIA to believe, carefully constructed lies wrapped in enough truth to seem credible. Other reports probably nailed aspects of Soviet operations because they derived from low-level conversations nobody bothered to manage. The analysts couldn't tell which was which in real time. They hedged, cross-referenced against other sources, marked assessments with confidence levels that reflected uncertainty about whether the tunnel material was compromised. And they kept using it anyway because the alternative was ignoring hundreds of thousands of conversations that might contain genuine intelligence. You don't throw away that volume of material just because some of it might be deception. The East German maintenance crew broke through on April 22, 1956, around mid-morning. Official story says they were repairing the Schonefelder Chaussee trunk line. Dig down 6 feet, expose the cables, discover the chamber. Raise alarm. Soviet officers arrive within the hour looking appropriately outraged for the cameras that somehow showed up very quickly. The tunnel stayed intact. Moscow didn't collapse it or fill it with concrete. They turned it into a propaganda exhibit instead. Guided tours for East German youth groups and foreign delegations. Walk through American espionage. See the equipment. Understand Western perfidy. The recorder array sat there gathering dust, the tap rig still clamped to cables that hadn't carried signal since the discovery. Some tours ran into the 1960s. I've seen accounts from visitors describing the ventilation system still functional, the lighting still working, everything preserved like a museum. The Soviets maintained it better than you'd expect for a Cold War relic nobody was using operationally. When the wall came down in 1989, the tunnel became a historical curiosity instead of a propaganda tool. Reunification crews inspected it during infrastructure surveys, found the equipment corroded but recognizable. The recorder heads seized, the amplifiers oxidized. 33 years of neglect visible in every component. Parts of the tunnel are still there, not accessible to tourists. The entrance got sealed and the vertical shaft filled in sometime in the 1990s. But the main tunnel section exists underground, a void running 1,476 feet through Berlin clay, connecting two nations that don't exist anymore. American sector to Soviet sector, concepts that stopped meaning anything in 1990. There's a museum now on the western end where the warehouse cover building stood. Allied Museum in Berlin-Dahlem. They've got a section of the tunnel reconstructed with original equipment, photos from the operation, declassified documents explaining how it worked. Sanitized version, obviously. The Blake story gets mentioned, but the full scope of the compromise stays vague because intelligence services don't like admitting how thoroughly they got burned. The tap chamber probably collapsed by now. 20 feet of overburden, no maintenance for 3 decades, water seepage, weakening the structure. The clay that made digging so difficult in 1954 would reclaim the space eventually. Nature filling in human engineering like it always does given enough time. I wonder if anyone's still alive who worked the tunnel during operation. The technicians who ran the recorders, the couriers who moved tape to London, the translators who processed conversations in shifts. They'd be in their 90s now if they survived this long. Probably never talked about it publicly. The kind of work that stays classified even after the principals are dead. The conversations are archived somewhere. Has to be. CIA doesn't throw away intelligence product even when it's compromised. Boxes of transcripts in a warehouse in Virginia or wherever they store Cold War remnants, cross-referenced to recordings on magnetic tape that's probably degraded past recovery unless they migrated it to digital storage, which they probably didn't because who funds preservation of 50-year-old SIGINT of dubious reliability? Blake died in Moscow in December 2020 at 98. Never apologized.